All right, Genesis 41. There's a word I've brought up several times in Genesis 37. Really captures the essence of the last section of Genesis 37 to 50. It's the word providence. You've heard me say that. I'll continue to say it all the way through Genesis 50. As I was thinking through this, John Piper recently wrote a book on the subject of providence, strangely enough entitled Providence. It's not only in book form, by the way, it's online for free, is what I understand. I was thinking about God's providence, and that book came into my mind, and I don't even have the book, but I was thinking about it, and I wanted to give you some kind of definition or description, I should say probably, of what providence actually is. And I like what Piper says about it. I looked it up. Piper says, by the way, I have the notes on this, and it's got all the definitions and all some of the things we're going to talk about tonight in the back, or maybe you've had it already, I don't know. But Piper says, providence is a wise and purposeful sovereignty. Think about that. It's a wise and purposeful sovereignty. God purposely carries out his purposes. In fact, Piper also writes this, absolutely everything that needs to be done to bring about his purposes, God sees to it that it happens. Piper makes a big deal out of the fact that God sees to it that what he's going to bring about actually happens. And he says God takes steps to make sure it happens. That's his providence. Isaiah chapter 46, which is on your notes, verses 9 and 10 says this, I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things which have not been done, saying, what does he say? He says, my purpose shall be established. I'm going to accomplish all my good pleasure. My purpose shall be established. Now, there's a question and answer. Isn't it great that we wait until after the sermon starts to pass out the notes? That's my fault. We wait until after it gets going, and then we say, hey, let's pass out the notes now. Thank you, Floyd. I'll give him a second to do that. Thank you, Dr. Martin. All right, there's a question and answer statement that was written in 1563, called the Heidelberg Catechism. Here's a question from that catechism. Catechism is a question and answer form. Question is this, what do you understand by the providence of God? Answer, the almighty, everywhere present power of God, by his hand upholds the heaven and earth with all creatures, so he so governs them. He so governs them that herbs and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, health and sickness, riches and poverty, indeed all things come not by chance. These things don't happen by chance, but by his fatherly hand. So God governs the heaven and the earth and all creatures. There's another confession called the Belgic Confession of 1561. They said in that confession, we believe that this good God, after creating all things, did not abandon them to chance or fortune, but leads and governs them, there's the word governs again, governs them according to his holy will in such a way that nothing happens in this world without God's orderly arrangement. Orderly arrangement reminds us of the words Piper said, design and purpose. Westminster Larger Catechism, 1648. The question is asked, what are the works of providence? Answer, God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful preserving and governing of all his creatures, ordering them in all their actions to his own glory. What's the end of God's ordering things, all the things that there are in the world? It's for the praise of his glory. God's providence is intended to lead to God's praise. Now, in all these definitions, we saw words like governing, design, purpose, arrangement. And as we work our way through the details of Genesis 41 tonight, it's important to keep in mind the bigger picture that's going on here. We'll talk about Pharaoh, and we'll talk about dreams, and we'll talk about magicians, and we'll talk about Egypt. But there's something bigger going on here. Don't lose the forest for the trees. All the people mentioned, all the events, are part of something much more than anybody realizes in chapter 41 at the time. Behind all those events, behind all those people, there is a God directing everything to its appointed end. Now, it'll take us 2 weeks to get through Genesis chapter 41. But tonight I want us to think about God's providence over Pharaoh's dreams. That's the first main point we're going to look at in Genesis 41, God's providence over Pharaoh's dreams in the first 32 verses. And in light of his providence over Pharaoh's dreams, we're going to learn 3 lessons from this section. First lesson is this: false religion will fail. False religion will fail. Verses 1 to 8. It happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. Behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. They grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. Behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams. There was no one who can interpret them to Pharaoh. Now the scene has changed from chapter 40, from the king's prison, chapter 40, where Joseph was confined. Now we're in the king's palace. It's 2 years later after those events of chapter 40, and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is now sound asleep in dreamland. Not only is he dreaming, but he actually remembers the dreams. Now, we don't always remember our dreams. You ever had a dream, some strange dream, and you didn't remember it? But it doesn't have any bearing on our life anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. But back in Old Testament times, there were occasions when dreams did have an effect on the people, when the Lord brought revelation of that type to the people, sometimes in the Old Testament. Now, of course, the revelation of God is completed, and we don't need dreams anymore. Hopefully, you're not dreaming your life away here. You're looking to the Scriptures for all matters of faith and practice. But God sends these dreams to Pharaoh. It's God that did that in chapter 41. And God, he remembers them, Pharaoh does, because God wants him to remember them. He just doesn't understand what they mean. Now, in his first dream, Pharaoh is standing by the Nile River. Now, that's not unusual because he may have gone there every day. You remember in Exodus 2, I think verse 5, where Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the Nile to bathe. So this is not something unusual because the Nile River was everything to the Egyptians. It was everything. It was the primary source of their economic status, their economic stability, their social stability. The irrigation that came off was possible because of the Nile River. They were able to irrigate elsewhere. The Nile River flooded annually, and so they would have fertile soil around the Nile to grow crops. So it was just everything to them. While Pharaoh is standing beside the Nile, verse 2 says, there came up 7 cows. Why are they coming up, and where are they coming up from? Well, cows in Egypt along the Nile like to stand in the Nile. They're not stupid, these cows. They like to go in the Nile because they submerge themselves as much as possible to escape the heat, to escape the flies that are buzzing around. So that's what they're doing. And in his dream, these 7 cows come out of the river in order to feed on the grass, the grass that's next to the river. These cows, look at the text, they're described as sleek and fat, meaning they're healthy, they're well-proportioned, they're well-fattened. Nobody wants a skinny cow. Nobody's looking to buy a skinny cow if you go to the auction. They want a fattened cow. Then Pharaoh sees in his dream 7 more cows coming up off the Nile. They take their place next to the former set of cows. They're not feeding in the marsh grass. They're not healthy. They are not fat. They're ugly and gaunt. In other words, they're bony. They're skinny. They're emaciated, these cows. They could use a good steak to fatten them up. In fact, that's what they have in mind. And so they eat the 7 healthy cows. And for those of you, by the way, who like your steak rare, that's what these cows did here. They like their steaks rare as well. Now, you back off this dream and you say, well, that was bizarre. That was creepy. It's more like a nightmare. And so apparently Pharaoh is startled and he wakes up. But he soon drifts off to sleep again. Has another dream. This time there are no cows. By the way, I don't know if you know it tonight, but you all are sitting somewhere different, half of you. And it's really having an effect on me up here. I don't know, I guess in the providence of God it was intended to be that way. So he has another dream, and this time there are no cows, there is grain. There's 7 ears of grain, and they're all on a single stalk. That's a good sign because, in fact, it's described as they're being plump and good. For one stalk to have 7 grains, they say means it's a highly productive stalk. But the highly productive stalk is followed by, look, it says that 7 thin ears of grain that is scrawny, grain probably not even edible. It's also scorched by the east wind. Now that wind came through every spring and every fall. That was a wind that was hot and it was dry, and it blew through from the south and from the southeast, from North Africa and Arabia, and it destroyed plant life. And in fact, I think the same thing happens to this very day in Egypt. Same type wind. But just like the first dream, the 7 unhealthy ears of grain consume the 7 healthy ears of grain. And Pharaoh wakes up again. So Pharaoh is now woke. And you look back at that and you say, what a strange, Stephen got it. What a strange dream that is. I said Pharaoh was woke. Strange dream. Cows eating cows, and grain eating grain, and more than that, skinny cows eating fat cows, and thin ears of grain consuming plump ears of grain. That sounds like some kind of a weird dream I've had. Now in Egypt, ancient Egypt, cows and grain are a big deal. Cows are considered symbols of Egypt. Grain is a staple crop in Egypt. Egypt was famous for its cows, as a matter of fact. Egypt was famous for its grain. It's interesting he has these particular dreams. But what do we make of this? Look at verse 8. The next morning after his dreams, it says Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. He was disturbed. That same expression is used in Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar's spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him when he had his dreams, and Daniel came in to interpret. Very similar situation. Now, I'm sure that Pharaoh had other dreams, but these dreams, they got to him. These dreams were different. These dreams, he felt like, I've got to get professional help. I've got to know the meaning of these dreams. So he brings in his staff, who are experts at the interpretation of dreams. Verse 8, these are the magicians of Egypt. These are the wise men of Egypt. Now, when it says magicians, probably a reference, a lot of work has been done on this particular word, probably a reference to what they called a lector priest. A priest, a person who acted as a magician in service to the gods of Egypt. Also considered a teacher of wisdom, so a teaching priest in the Egyptian religion in the land of Egypt. And they've even discovered documents in Egypt where they've found that these, in text, they found that these magician priests claim to have done all kinds of extraordinary feats. In fact, one example that they have in that book, those texts, tells of a priest who made a wax crocodile. It looked like a crocodile made of wax. He threw it into a lake and it became a real crocodile. That's what they say in their book. These magician priests claim to possessed secret knowledge or mysterious knowledge. They knew things they said that other people didn't know. And they trained in a place called House of Life. That was their seminary, called the House of Life, strangely enough. In this House of Life, they produced books that could teach people in their system how to interpret dreams. They could learn how to discern and interpret symbols and things like that. And there in the House of Life, they learned to practice magic. They learned how to do magical arts. Now that reminded me of Exodus chapter 7. Exodus 7:11, where we're talking about the plagues of Egypt, and in that time later on. And Exodus 7:11 mentions the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt and their secret arts, it says. Their enchantments, their mysteries, their occultic practices. This is all part and parcel of the Egyptian religion. This is what they did in their religion. Now the wise men, it says in verse 8, they were guys who were very intellectual. They were capable advisors, and they were thought to be gifted by the gods. Again, we have the gods of Egypt, always talking about the gods of Egypt when you're talking about Egyptian religion. So for the Egyptians, this was serious business. Pharaoh relied upon these guys to interpret his dreams and for other reasons. And so he tells them his dreams. Look at the end of verse 8. Unfortunately for him, verse 8 says, there was no one, not a single person, not a single wise man or lector priest or magician that could interpret the dream to Pharaoh. No one. Now, what's interesting here, that includes Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh was considered a god in Egypt, and yet he could not figure out the meaning of his own dreams. Pharaoh's magicians could not figure out the meaning of the dreams. Even though they studied this subject for years, they were given government positions to do this very work of interpretation. And though the magician books claim they could do extraordinary feats, they could not do this extraordinary feat. They couldn't interpret the dream. And the wise men, the guys considered to be, maybe they're wise guys, more than wise men here, they were considered to be intellectuals, advisors to Pharaoh, and yet they couldn't interpret the dreams. Now, some commentators say, well, they could have interpreted the dreams, but they didn't want to do it and give bad news to Pharaoh. But that's not what it says in verse 8. It says there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Now, in all fairness, the magicians of Egypt were able to pull off a few tricks. You remember back in Exodus 7 again, Exodus 7, verses 11 and 12? The Lord tells Moses to throw his staff down, it becomes a serpent. And then the Egyptian magicians, what do? They replicate what Moses did. They do the same thing. Later on in that chapter, Moses, because of God's power, turns the Nile into a river into blood, and the fish die, and it stinks, and all this. In Exodus chapter 7, verse 22, it says, but the Egyptians of Egypt did the same with their what? Their secret arts. Their secret arts. In other words, their skills of the occult, their enchantments. They did the same thing. Now, we don't know what they look like, exactly what that looked like, how they replicated this, but the fact that Egyptian religion includes the occult means that this is satanic. This is a satanic religion that Pharaoh is trying to get advice from. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10, Israel's warned against these kind of things, practicing the occult. It says this, there shall not, it's in your notes, there shall not be found among you anyone who uses divination, or who practices witchcraft, or who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. None of these things should be allowed, because it says, for whoever does these things is what? He's detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them, he'll drive the Canaanites out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For those nations which you shall dispossess, those nations, they listen, it says. They listen to those who practice witchcraft and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. And needless to say, God's people should never, ever dabble in the occult. Some people ask that question. Can we do this? Can we have Ouija boards? Can we practice some kind of magic? God's people should never dabble in those things. That's forbidden territory. But the Egyptians did. And Pharaoh listened to these satanic advisors, wanted to know, hey, so what does this mean? I'm going to you guys for the answer. I will say this, Satan has power. He does have power. What is it? It's the power of darkness. That's what it is. And Satan's followers can be called wise men, as they are here, but it's the kind of wisdom that James 3 talks about. James 3, 13 to 18 talks about two kinds of wisdom, wisdom from above, the wisdom from below. And it says this kind of wisdom, the kind we're talking about in Genesis 41, verse 8, is not that which comes down from above. It's not heavenly wisdom, but it's earthly, it's natural, it's demonic. And any religion inspired and fueled by satanic philosophy is doomed to fail. It's going to fail. Now, there are many religions which appear outwardly pious. On the surface, it looks very much like a religion's supposed to look. Their garments they wear, their chants, their prayers, their rituals all seem to be what it should be, but it's only a form of what may appear to be godliness. There's no power of God involved in that. Not at all. It's just an outer shell, no real substance. In fact, if you get a chance later on, read through 2 Timothy chapter 3, 2 Timothy 3 says in latter times, bad things are going to happen. And it says in 2 Timothy 3:5 that there are people who are going to be holding to a form of godliness, 2 Timothy 3:5, but they're denying the power thereof. Holding to the form, denying its power. That section, a few verses later, is followed up with the mention of these magicians in Exodus chapter 7, verse 11. Mentions their names. And in 2 Timothy 3, they're described somewhere around verse 7, 8. They're described as men who oppose the truth, men of depraved mind, men who are rejected in regard to the faith. It's a false religion. Now, no matter what they are able to conjure up, even with Satan's power, this ultimately fails. It failed Pharaoh. What they will offer up will help no one. There's no true salvation in a false religion, a religion opposed to God's truth. Anything opposed to God's truth out there. And people get sucked up into this, and so-called Christians get sucked up into this. And I have warned people over the years who I tell you, I've had people involved that I've seen involved in the church. I've seen Jehovah's Witnesses talking to them. And they're listening to them, inviting them home. And I went to them and said, please do not do this thing. You're going the wrong way. And it happens. And it's happening here. In Exodus 7, the staff of the Egyptian magicians did turn a staff into a serpent. They did that, yes. But it was swallowed up by Aaron's staff, showing the superiority of God, right? And the fact that they made the bloody Nile even more unpleasant. Remember they did that? They replicated that. They made it more unpleasant with their secret arts. Rather than returning it to its watery substance means they made things worse. They didn't help the cause out. They made it even worse. And so false religion makes things worse for people, not better. It doesn't even keep it on an even keel. It makes it worse. Exodus 8:18, the magicians tried to replicate the plague of gnats. Later on in Exodus chapter 8. But it says in Exodus 8:18, they could not. They couldn't do it. There was a stopping point with all this. Satan has power, yes, but it's limited. It's limited. No way can it compare to God's power. So Pharaoh's men failed to soothe the troubled mind of Pharaoh. He's troubled, disturbed, and they can't deal with this. Now you contrast that with Christ and what he can do. The peace that he gives. Jesus said, my peace I give to you in John 14. My peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives. And so false religion fails. Secondly, the second lesson we see in this section is that God's timing is perfect. His timing is perfect. Look at verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. That was in chapter 40. We had a dream on the same night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard. And we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted to us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, but he hanged him. Now, if we consider the chronology of Genesis 40, Joseph was 28 years old in chapter 40 in the prison, the end of chapter 40. He's said to be 30 years old in verse 46 of chapter 41, the chapter we're in right now. But in chapter 40, he's 28. Then chapter 41, verse 1 says 2 years passed. And then Pharaoh has these dreams. So we said a couple of weeks ago, I said that meant 2 more years in the big house for Joseph. 2 more years in the king's prison. We asked the question, why? Why did it take 2 more years for the chief cupbearer to remember that Joseph had interpreted his dreams? Why? Joseph was there for 2 more years. My guess is that on the human level, I don't think the chief cupbearer, this is the chief cupbearer, this is a high position in Egypt, very high position in the government. I don't think he was concerned all that much about Joseph. I really don't. He thinks of him as a foreigner. He talks about him being a foreigner in here. He's a Hebrew youth. He's a servant or a slave. Whereas the chief cupbearer holds this high government position. And once the cupbearer was restored to his place before Pharaoh, Joseph becomes a distant memory. Well, not going to remember all that. I'm back in the palace, so he's happy. But now the cupbearer sees that no one can interpret this dream, Pharaoh's dreams, and his memory suddenly jogged, and so he goes to Pharaoh. He wants to help him out, I'm sure, but I think also he wants to increase his favor with the king, and he tells him, hey, there's a guy that told me, that interpreted my dream back in prison. I'm just remembering this. But I ask the question still, 2 more years in prison for Joseph. What if that was you? And you said, hey, don't remember chapter 40, he told the guy, don't forget about me. I'm over here in prison. Get me out of this place, this house, he calls it. What if that was you? What if that was me in prison for 2 more years? 2 more years of that. We'll have to question why. Why did this happen? Why did it have to be like this? Why did he have to spend 2 more years in prison like that? Well, for one thing, if the cupbearer, when he got out of prison, had told Pharaoh immediately, hey, there's a guy in prison that interpreted my dreams. He's a good guy. I'm going to put in a good word for him. And Pharaoh said, okay, release him. What would have happened? He would have gone back to Canaan. That would have been the end of the Joseph story. It would have been all over. But now at this point, 2 years later, now it's just at this point, 2 years later, Pharaoh is vitally interested in this particular prisoner he's told about. This Hebrew youth may hold the key to unlock the meaning of my dreams. And if we have discovered already in the book of Genesis, the Lord has his own timetable. He works according to his schedule, not ours. Now, we're very anxious for the Lord to be on Eastern Standard Time, right? We want him to be on our timetable. We say things, I need a certain thing done by Thursday at 4 o'clock. Please pray that it'll happen, right? And maybe God will answer that prayer that way. Maybe he'll answer that prayer that way. I'm not saying he's not going to. But he may make us wait 2 more years. That may happen. And we wonder why. Why does this happen? Listen to this incredible, I always love John Calvin's quotes because he's such an amazing theologian. Listen to what John Calvin says about this. Nothing is more improper than to prescribe the time in which God shall help us. Nothing is more improper than to prescribe the time in which God shall help us. Lord, you need to help me now. I want everything now, personally. Like today, I want it done. But nothing's more improper than to do that since, listen to this great quote, since God purposely, for a long season, keeps his own people in suspense. I've never heard anybody say it before. He keeps his own people in suspense that by this very experiment, they may truly know what it is to trust him. That's why. The Lord may keep us in suspense. He may keep you in suspense. You want something. You're asking the Lord for something. Would you do this thing for me? Would you do it now for me? I need it done now. I have a timetable here I'm working with. Yeah, he's got a timetable he's working with too. It's his. We asked him that. Maybe he keeps us in suspense. Why? So we can learn to trust him. Okay. It's up to you. What you do is up to you. Jeremy Buskell this morning said it took several years for, I think it was the first 7 years it took before Judson had 6 or 7 converts. Adnam Judson in Burma. Why? Well, the Lord has ways of working. It took him all that time to come up with the translation of the Burmese Bible. Here's the thing. It's not for us to inform the Lord as to when he should get the ball rolling for us. It's not for us to inform him of that. I know I do it too. I do it too, and I get frustrated, and I get impatient, and all these things. But the Lord is the one who decides the timing of events. He decides. It's for us to be patient and to trust his timing. That's easier said than done. I wonder what Joseph thought for 2 years, those extra 2 years. He was in his seminary, Alan, of jail. But who are we to demand of God that you should do a thing, this or that for me according to my schedule? Now, the Lord may be merciful when you present it to him in a humble way. Lord, if you can give me an answer by Thursday, he may not. I don't know what he's going to do. No matter how impatient I may be, I'll pick on myself. No matter how impatient I may be, I do know this. The Lord knows what he is doing. He knows what, we may not know what he's doing all the time. He knows why he's doing it. He knows how to go about it. And he knows when to do it. So just at the right time, in God's estimation, he allows the cupbearer to have his memory triggered and introduce Pharaoh to this Hebrew youth who's still in the prison. God's timing is perfect. Even if we don't think it is, he thinks it is. Third lesson, God deserves all praise. He deserves all praise. Look at verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out. Hurry up and wait, Joseph. And out of the dungeon, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it. And I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Now, we don't know exactly how long Joseph was in prison. At least I don't know exactly how long he was in prison. I think definitely more than 2 years. For all we know, it may have been 5 years or more. I don't know. But once Pharaoh finds out one of his prisoners has this ability to interpret dreams, things begin to move quickly. Oh, you've been waiting for 2 years. No longer. Boom, let's go. Let's get things moving quickly. No more delay. Orders are given. Pharaoh's underlings start moving, jumping into action. Joseph, look at verse 14. He's hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. What's the hurry now? I've been waiting for 2 years. Hurriedly brought out of dungeon. The word hurriedly is from a word meaning to run. And there's a verse in the Bible I thought of when I was reading this. It says in 1 Samuel 21, the king's business requires haste. And when kings give an order, they want you to get moving. And that's what happens here. I love verse 14, by the way. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. What a great verse, right? And so they move, but there's something needs to be done. Joseph has to he's got to shave his beard. He has to change his prison garments into presentable garments. Then he's ushered in, before he can appear before Pharaoh at his court, he's got to do this. He's got to be presentable in their estimation of what Egyptians are acceptable to the Egyptians. And he is ushered into the presence of Pharaoh himself. And Matthew Henry says, it's a great quote, he says, Joseph was committed to the king's prison that he might be preferred to the king's person. In other words, Joseph's experience in prison was what led him to the introduction to Pharaoh and his court. If he had not been in prison, in the king's prison, he would have never met Pharaoh. That's one reason he was there. I don't know. It's what God does, how he does things. Pharaoh admits to Joseph he has a problem. What's your problem? And no one can interpret my dream. I'm troubled about this. And it's the same thing if you go back to chapter 40, verse 8. Same thing the cupbearer and the baker told Joseph while they were in prison. No one can interpret our dream, which is why they were so sad and dejected in chapter 40. And then Pharaoh says he's heard that Joseph can interpret dreams. I've heard about you from this guy who can't remember anything, that you can interpret dreams. But Joseph wants to make it crystal clear to Pharaoh, no, I cannot interpret dreams. I can't do that. He says, look at verse 16, it's not in me. The phrase is literally apart from me. It's apart from me. Joseph is saying the interpretation of dreams is not something I'm able to muster up on my own. It's outside of the sphere of what I can do, what I have the ability to do. I can't do that. I think often he wants to make sure that Pharaoh knows who does this. It's not him. It's not in him. I think oftentimes we like to share some of the glory the Lord alone deserves. I think we do. Sure, we want God to receive glory. We say that, right? All glory be to God. But maybe if we can get some recognition for ourselves while we're at it. Is that too much to ask? A little bit of recognition? As a matter of fact, it is too much to ask. All praise is supposed to go to the Lord. We don't reserve some of it, no matter how small, for ourselves. Joseph is very concerned. You'll see this again and again throughout this section. He's very concerned that Pharaoh know the true source of interpretation. It's God, and it's God alone. Not him, not anybody else. It's God and God alone. He says God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. He's got so much confidence in his God. Think about what's happening here. Joseph standing in the presence of Pharaoh. This guy who gets kidnapped from, and he uses the word kidnapped, stolen, from Canaan, and he comes in, and now he's standing before Pharaoh. Well, who would have ever thought this was going to happen? Not him. And yet, he had those dreams earlier, but I didn't think he envisioned this, and yet he assures Pharaoh to his face, God's going to answer you. You know what he's just told Pharaoh? He's just told him this in so many words. God's superior to Egyptian religion, and he's superior to you too. Don't worry, Pharaoh. My God will take care of it. Obviously, yours can't. You can't. You're supposed to be a God, but God will. Now, when it says God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer, that's literally he will answer the peace of Pharaoh. He'll answer the peace of Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh was a troubled man. His conscience is disturbed. And only God can calm the troubled soul. And Joseph makes sure Pharaoh understands, your religion has failed you. He didn't say it outright, but he wants him to know God will not fail you. God will answer the peace of Pharaoh. Now, in the false prophets in the Old Testament, when they gave an answer to a king, the king says, hey, I need an answer about a particular issue we're dealing with politically here. What's the answer? They're not going to give him any bad news. They never do that. The prophets, they wanted to remain on the false prophets wanted to remain on the good side of their rulers. And so there's verses that say peace, peace, when they'd say peace, peace, when there is no peace. Joseph's not a false prophet. He's not doing that. He has only one interest, to tell Pharaoh exactly the truth. Whatever God says, that's what I'm going to tell you. That's all he does. So all we're supposed to do, by the way. We have no other job than that. We have no other job when we preach than that, to tell God's truth. Joseph is confident. Before he gets the interpretation, he's confident God's going to come through. That's the confidence he has in God. That's the faith he has in God. Look at verse 17. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, in my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. Here's the dream. Behold, 7 cows, which fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly, and gaunt, such as I have never seen for all ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 cows. So he relates his first dream. And he adds, in this accounting of the dream, he adds some additional statements to the first time we saw this dream. The 7 lean cows are not only ugly and gaunt, they are poor and very ugly and gaunt. In fact, these are the worst looking cows I've ever seen in my life, he says. And they have and cows are big in Egypt. And secondly, when the lean cows devoured the fat cows, there's no change in their body composition. Not at all. They're still thin. They're still scrawny. They're still bony. Now, you've heard people say, I'm so hungry I could eat a cow. You've probably heard me say that. Or other words to the effect, maybe a horse or something. But think about this. If you could actually eat an entire cow, how much you would weigh? You'd look like a cow, first of all. But these cows can eat a cow and not gain any weight. Now, this is the diet plan everybody dreams of, right? If I can only have this particular plan. Look at the verse 22, next dream. I saw also in my dream, Pharaoh says to Joseph, he says, behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. We keep seeing this idea that there's no one that can give me an answer to this. The only thing added here to the first accounting of the dream is that the thin ears of grain are also withered. But basically, Pharaoh recounts both dreams to Joseph. Joseph gets it. Okay, he doesn't waste any time. He is not even praying. I think over in Daniel 2, he asks his friends I was going to say compatriots. Am I allowed to say that word? Daniel asks his friends to pray with him. They don't even do that here. Joseph doesn't waste any time. He gets right into it. Here's the interpretation, verse 25. Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good ears are 7 years. 7 good ears are 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. The 7 thin ears, scorched by the east wind, will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt. And after them, 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of that subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. Here are the main points of this interpretation. Joseph says, number 1, the dreams do not have separate meanings. The one dream reinforces the next, the former one. Secondly, the number 7, you see so many times here. as in 7 good cows, 7 lean cows, 7 good ears of grain, 7 bad ears of grain. The number 7 means 7 years. It's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, as represented by the unhealthy cows and grain. And then number 3, note the heavy emphasis here on the 7 years of famine. Look at verse 30. Things are going to get so bad, Pharaoh, that people are going to forget the former years of plenty. Forget all about it. Those great years of plenty, nobody's even going to remember it. And then famine is going to ravage the land. Literally, it's going to consume the land. All the crops are going to fail. Verse 31, the abundance of food that we had formerly is going to be unknown in the land. It's going to be so severe. It's going to be devastating. The fourth main point, the fulfillment of this dream, Pharaoh, is going to happen soon. Verse 25, this is what God is about to do. Verse 28, God is about to do this. Verse 32, it will happen quickly. The fifth main point in this interpretation, this is Pharaoh. This is all God's doing. Every bit of it. God gave you this dream. It wasn't because Pharaoh ate too much garlic, ate too many leeks. That's not why. It's because God visited this dream upon him. And it's not just another dream. Look at verse 25. God has told the Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 28, God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 32, the matter is determined by God. God will bring it about quickly. 4 times, Joseph tells the king over all Egypt, God is the one behind all this. He's testified of God. Joseph has testified of God in Potiphar's house, and he testified of God in the king's prison, and now he's testifying of God before Pharaoh, consistently all throughout, testifying of God. Same thing we're to do, wherever we're at or at whatever we're doing. All this time, Pharaoh is listening to this interpretation. He's listening. He's not saying anything. He's not arguing. He's not debating the point. Pharaoh is as subject to God's will as anybody in his kingdom. There's no difference between the relationship of Pharaoh and God, except God gives him the dream, as he often does to kings in the Old Testament. He just sits back and listens to all. Joseph is not crediting himself with any of this at all. He gives all glory to God. God did all this. I didn't do anything. Now, we all know the verse in Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is like channels of water. In the hand of the Lord, he turns it wherever he wishes. In Pharaoh's case, not only does he control his heart, he controls his dreams. He enters in his dreams. Think about the depths of providence, all the way to Pharaoh's dreams. Who would think that would ever happen? Now, there are many examples all throughout Scripture of God controlling kings, of guiding kings, just a couple. Early on in the book of Exodus 1:8, and later on says, a new king, this is after Joseph's time, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Another king, didn't know anything about Joseph. I don't know why. They should have kept records in the Egyptian government. But that Pharaoh will make life difficult for the Hebrew people in the land of Egypt. But when God levels those 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, he realizes he's no match for the Lord. And it illustrates once again the principle, Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As rivers of water, channels of water, he guides it whatever direction he wants to. And then the king's heart is subject to the Lord's power. In that same story, in Exodus, that next Pharaoh, it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Talk about the heart of the king being in the hand of the Lord. The Lord hardened it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that does not mean that the king's heart was tender and receptive to the gospel. And out of pure meanness, God says, I'm just going to make his heart obstinate as stone, and he's going to reject me. That's not what happened. The Lord took the heart of a blatant idolater, Pharaoh, and he confirmed it in its callous condition. In fact, in Exodus 5, chapter 5, verse 2, Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey him? I don't know the Lord. That was his attitude. He's an obstinate man, and yet God shows his superiority over Egypt and the gods of Egypt. And then in 2 Chronicles 36:22, another illustration. 2 Chronicles 36:22, I have it in your notes here. We see the Lord working through another king, Cyrus, king of Persia, in regard to Judah. This is after the Babylonian captivity, and God directs Cyrus, and it says in 2 Chronicles 36:22, also says in Ezra chapter 1, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord in the mouth of Jeremiah. I won't go into this, okay? This is another great incident in the scripture. The Lord, what did he do? He stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. Cyrus is ruling over a vast kingdom, and God picks Cyrus, the pagan Cyrus, to stir up his spirit so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom, and he also put it in writing saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kings of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem." The Lord stirred up his spirit. And you see that thing repeated again, that kind of thing repeated again and again in the Old and New Testaments. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He turns it whatever way he wants to, directs it wherever he wants to. Pharaoh may be the king of Egypt, but there's a greater king than he in charge of this whole operation. And it's for the good of God's people, as we'll see in the time to come, and it's for the good of the whole world, for that matter. One commentator said this, another really good quote on this: "The future in Egypt does not depend upon Pharaoh. He does not get to decide. In fact, Pharaoh is irrelevant and marginal to the future of the kingdom. Joseph has calmly announced to the Lord of Egypt that the future is out of his hands." In Genesis 21, it's clear that Pharaoh can cause no future, nor can he resist the future that God will bring. And we should be grateful that our hands are ultimately, our lives are not ultimately in our hands, they're in the hands of God. If the Lord were not directing our steps, I shudder to think what we would do, what decisions we would make. It'd be horrible. By ourselves, left to ourselves, what would we do? But the Lord directs our steps. We don't know what the future holds. We can't predict it. We can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. No one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what events may come our way, but believers do know this. We know the one who does know these things, and he's worthy of our praise. All religions, all belief systems outside of Christ, they're all in vain. They will all fail, but God will not fail. It's not for us to try to play God with our lives. That's not for us to do. Our responsibility is to we're to be responsible, of course, but our responsibility is to trust God, to testify of God, and to give him all the glory. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, again, we're grateful for your word, grateful for what we learn from the stories in the Old Testament. Thankful, Lord, for your providence. We don't understand it oftentimes. We're perplexed oftentimes, but that's where we need to learn to trust you. God, give us a church here that trusts you, that believes you, that has great confidence in you and your word. Praise in Christ's name. Amen.